of the PMI Budapest Hungarian chapter. Today we can welcome our special guest from the United States, Greta Blush from San Diego, or the San Diego area. To tell you a very quick story about Greta and why she's with us today. To be honest with you, back in, I think in May, I attended a conference in Dublin, Ireland. Greta came over to me saying, "Hey, Laszlo, are you from Budapest?" And I told her, "Yes, I'm from Budapest." And she says, "Look, I would like to talk to you because, quite frankly, I'm very much interested in your local chapter. The reason is very simple, because actually, as you can see, my family name is Blush, but actually it comes from a Hungarian family name called Balázs." And Greta also explained to me that his husband, he's got his roots in Hungary, and that's the reason why we started a little conversation, and we met the day after. And it was a great privilege that I received a very nice book from Greta, which was all about project management. And finally, we started a conversation with her, and finally, she volunteered to deliver a webinar for all of us. So that's why we are here today. The other thing I wanted to share with you, that just recently Greta and her husband joined the PMI Budapest Hungarian chapter. So welcome on board, Greta. Thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours. I would like to pass over to you, and I would like you to give me instructions when you would like me to advance the slides. So over to you, Greta.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm excited to do this. This is kind of fun. I'm going to be talking about the relationship of project management Agile. And actually, when I teach project management now, it's very hard for me not to combine the two of them, because there's so much overlap and there's so much that we can do as a result. So let's go to the next slide. As you can see, I have a couple of certifications. I've just recently got the PGMP. And those of you that have been in project management for any time, I would highly recommend that even if you don't have the qualifications to sit for that certification, that you do some studying on it. It just increases so much the understanding of how to work on a project. A lot of the program management aspects are critical. I also have the PBA and have actually worked on I was a SME actually on the new BA guide that was put out, even though I don't necessarily recommend that to everybody, but I do recommend the practice guide on business analysis, because once again, it just adds a lot to what you're doing. Got the ACP a number of years ago, and I actually teach all these certifications as well as work with teams that do them. So excited to be able to share my knowledge and experience with you. Next slide.
I beg your pardon, Greta, just a quick question. Guys, I need a quick confirmation. I received a couple of incoming messages and people are reporting that they can't hear us. So I need a quick confirmation. First of all, guys, can you hear me? Can you please send me a yes or no? Yes, 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 yes. So most of you can hear me. Excellent. Okay. Janos Petrovic, Norbert, Martin. Okay, now the second question. Can you hear Greta? Can you please confirm that you can hear Greta? Petra, Bence, okay, great, excellent. So for those of you who can't hear us, obviously this is very difficult. I would like to ask one of you, please go to the chat window and ask the colleagues to use the dial-in number. So technically speaking, the line is open, everybody can hear us, everybody can see us. A couple of people are experiencing some technical difficulties. I apologize for that, but just for those of you who can't hear us, this call is being recorded and I'm going to share with you the recording. So back to you, Greta. Thank you very much. I apologize for this interruption.
No problem. Next slide. I want to kind of talk about just things in general. I want to talk about the Agile mindset first, and then just really briefly hit on the approaches. I mean, there's a lot of approaches out there, but there's some key things that we get from a mixture of all of these. Then we'll talk about both the tools and techniques for monitoring and planning and monitoring, controlling, and how those apply to any project, not just necessarily an Agile project. And then finally, the whole idea of continuous improvement. This is something that I think Agile has had a big impact on PMI and project management in general over the last at least two editions of the PMBOK guide. Next slide. So we talk about the mindset, and I think that in reality, the mindset is more important than being specific on the tools and techniques, but being able to understand how this mindset that came from Agile and actually came from Lean is the thing that we need to look at first. And I think once you embody that mindset, going forward, you'll see projects, you'll see activities very different. Next slide. So this shows the Standish Group Chaos Report from 1998. That's a long time ago, and it's taken us a long time to get to where we are. But what that said back there you just have to be willing to not know everything when you get started and you're in a discovery mode. The last one is, this goes back to this whole idea of functional matrix, project-oriented or projectized organizations. Um, you really have to be where this team has been pulled aside and works together, as opposed to being in a matrix type of an organization, because there you still have some additional management structure from the outside that will impact the work that we're doing. Next page. So we have a couple of things, and probably one of the biggest things that's happened with Agile is that it has changed the way a project manager is looked upon. They're not a manager anymore. And in fact, in some cases, some of the Agile methods said, we don't even want a project manager, because project managers command and control, as opposed to saying they really are a leader. And a leader has to have that vision of where we're trying to go and help the team meet that. They have to have the positive environment for people to be able to work within it. Also, one of the key things is recognizing that conflict is not disagreement. You want people to disagree because you want to take two different points of view and figure out what's the best way to do something. But we have a lot of areas that we have brought in, and this comes into the 6th edition, and partly because of the Agile, that we talk more about emotional intelligence, we talk about adaptive leadership, we talk about situational leadership, and we talk about servant leadership. And I always point everybody to the Agile Practice Guide to understand servant leadership. Mike Griffith, who wrote this, or one of the key people who wrote the practice guide, has an excellent explanation of how servant leadership applies to a project. And I would recommend that, if nothing more, you look at that particular section within the Agile Practice Guide. Next slide. Okay, so there's a number of Agile approaches. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. I put this in here first, though, because part of what happens is we get an organization that says, hey, we're going to start doing Agile. Everything's going to be Agile. I actually was working with Boeing about a year and a half ago, and they said, hey, we're going to go Agile. And I'm thinking, oh, I hope you're not going to use Agile to build a plane. And we kind of see some of the things that are happening. What this diagram, which is a Stacey diagram, basically says is looking at a particular effort that's been presented as a project and making a decision, what kind of methodology should you use? So if things are close to agreement, close to certainty, I mean, payroll, accounts payable, accounts receivable, those things are pretty close to agreement. We don't need to use Agile for those. Those can work under still a predictive environment. On the other hand, if it's super chaotic, up on the top right-hand corner, you probably need the structure to be able to use some sort of more of a predictive method. But those things that are in the center, those things that are complex, those things that are a little bit more complicated, those are the areas that you need to be able to say, let's try something and see if it works. Let's be a little bit more creative, because we don't have all the answers up front. So those are really the type of projects that benefit the most from using more of an agile or adaptive approach. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into these in any detail because they are defined in the PMBOK guide as well as being defined in the Agile Practice Guide. I put all of these, the iterative, the incremental, and the agile, all under the adaptive, because I think it's a mixture of all of those. And actually, in reality, I think most of us that have been doing projects for a length of time have been doing, especially the iterative, by chunking things into smaller pieces, or the incremental of adding a little bit more every time we come out. Incremental is pretty much product management, where Apple just came out with the iPhone 11. They used an incremental approach to that to say, what do we add to the iPhone 10. So that whole portion. But in reality, and once again, in the Agile Practice Guide, there's some really good graphic pictures of this hybrid with the idea that you might have your planning in more of a predictive manner, but then your actual development would be adaptive. Or on the other hand, if you have, say, a server that has to be installed or certain things that have to be done in a very sequential manner, you could do it adaptive with a little bit of predictive in that. That's what's considered the hybrid. And that's where, in most cases, we have to be able to move towards figuring out which pieces work best with what we're trying to do. Next slide. So there's a number of different Agile frameworks or methods we talk about. Some of them are much more commonly used than others. Lean Scrum by far is probably the best known. They do a great marketing job on this. XP's been around for a long time. It's more of a programming approach. Kanban is more manufacturing, and I'm seeing a lot of people who cannot work in a very small time period of Scrum moving to a Kanban method or combination of those two. The other ones I put down here are really more system development, software development type of approaches. DSDM is the one that actually Mike Griffith came from, which is, once again, the main author for the practice guide. It's very, very close to a traditional methodology with just the Agile added in. And so a lot of organizations move there first before they go to these others. Next slide. So lean is really more the mindset than anything else. Those principles of eliminating the waste. When they say amplify learning, that's that retrospective. That's that looking back, lessons learned. Deciding as late as possible as to how you're going to do something, but still delivering some small piece as fast as possible. Empowering the team, building that integrity in and seeing the whole. But the number one thing is that eliminate waste. And this actually comes as a competency of a business analyst who, when they're eliciting requirements, not collecting, will ask, why are we doing this? Just because we've done it before? No. What is the real purpose for it? Eliminating anything that doesn't need to be done. Next slide. So Scrum, this is the one that most people know about. Very highly iterative, short repeating cycles, 2 to 3 weeks a lot of times. You're using this concept of a backlog where you're able to put a bunch of things out there, almost like, at least in my case, I equate it to an Amazon wish list. Put anything out there that I want to put out there. And then being able to collaborate with the product owner, with the rest of the team members through that co-location, and a daily check-in as to how things are going. At the end, we demonstrate something to get that acceptance that we need, but we also use the retrospective, which is the Scrum term, to continuously improve what we're doing. Next slide. XP is very different because it's really just programming, very, very short sprints or iterations, 1 week. This is the one that has the pair programming. So when you really talk about quality, this is probably the one that recognizes the quality the highest because they have somebody doing it and the review is being done at the same time so that you catch things rather than having that delay. But a lot of more development aspects within the XP. Next slide. Kanban is more talking about looking at just-in-time work so that you end up seeing and working on the most important thing first and then getting it done and then going to the next one, but not pushing things like when you finish developing something has to be tested, and rather than pushing it to the testers, you wait until the tester has time and they pull so that they have the time to work on something. There's a great YouTube video out there on multitasking where somebody is tossing a ball to somebody, and if you toss one, they can catch it. If you toss two, they probably can catch both of them. Toss three, most likely they're going to miss at least one, if not more. So the idea is you concentrate on what you're working on. And also with this Kanban board, which is very popular, or some sort of way of looking at it, that Kanban board shows you where some of your bottlenecks may be. Next slide. DSDM, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but I think the most important thing that I see out of this is that we invert our triple constraint, iron triangle, whatever you want to call it, we invert it now. So rather than saying, what is our scope and therefore how long is it going to take and how much it's going to cost, turn it around. Because in most cases, we have a time frame in which to deliver something. And then we look at the scope from what can actually provide the most value as we do that. And we'll look at the prioritization as we do that. Next slide. So this is a slide or graphic that's actually in the practice guide where it talks about the fact that we have those 4 values from the manifesto, and we have 12 principles that I kind of went through. And then we have all these practices. But what you have to do, everybody, just like we do in the PMBOK guide, we don't do everything exactly the way it's being presented. We look at our project and we decide what's the most important and what can we do properly. So just like we don't do all 49 processes hardly ever on an actual project, we're not going to do every single one of these things on an Agile project. Next slide. So a couple of things as we look at the difference between here. In order to optimize that value of the delivery, in an incremental, we're just doing more frequent delivery. And I could have just called this adaptive versus predictive too. When we're doing a traditional or predictive, most often the value is not delivered until the very end. This is very similar to when we talk about benefits being delivered from a program. Sometimes we can deliver small benefits earlier, and sometimes, like if you're building a dam, you're not going to get your benefits until it's completely done. When we do the traditional prioritization, we have to prioritize because we select everything up front. Whereas with the adaptive, what we're doing is we're prioritizing closer to the time when we're going to deliver it, which allows us to change those priorities as the organization and objectives change. The cost of change being reduced because the fact that we are not basically going back and undoing things, but rather we're waiting until we're ready to do it. We don't have to make that cost a change. Now, once again, it isn't that we don't have change control. We do. In Scrum, in a 2-week increment, there is no change allowed in that 2-week time period, which, I think most people can hold off for 2 weeks if they need to change something. But that's part of what we have to look at, is making sure that we're making those adjustments. And I wouldn't call them necessarily changes, but we are making mid-course adjustments as we're going through this. Next slide. So let's just go back and look at some of the tools and techniques for planning, because some of these are very similar. Some of these just are modified a little bit. Next slide. So from the standpoint of initiating, it depends on the organization. The big thing is, and this should be the same for any project, it has to be based on the value that is going to be provided to the receiving organization. Portfolio management, if you have it, is not any different because we're still selecting something to be done as a project. Portfolio management doesn't say how you're going to do it. It just says this is what we think is going to support our strategic objectives, and therefore we're going to provide funding or resources from the organization. We do change a little bit on our project charter because it's going to have a little bit broader meaning. And we put in this thing called iteration 0. I think actually we do this anyway, but think about a construction project. If a construction project starts, they do a lot of staging. They set up the maybe the location where the management's going to be. They get a lot of the equipment and a lot of the supplies there prior to starting the work. That's what we're talking about iteration 0. It may be getting people authorized through their security clearances or whatever kind of testing needs to be put in place. All of that has to be part of some time effort that's done once prior to starting the project. And in Agile, we call that iteration 0. Next slide. So we talk about chartering, not project chart. So part of this comes, there's twofold. One, we have more stakeholder involvement early on in the project, but we also usually have our entire team involved by the time we start, rather than waiting as the project manager does the plan and then we acquire the team members. But the chartering is not just what we're doing, what's the objective, and authorizing the project manager and the sponsor and everything, but it's why are we doing this? What is the vision? What do we think we're going to have at the end? And what is the mission? What are those objectives and things that we're trying to support? But lastly, what is the criteria? What's the success criteria? How do we know when we actually deliver what we're supposed to do? So either this is written during that very first time, which is very similar to what we do on a project, or it could be written before it's given to us. Next slide. So when we do planning within an adaptive mode, we usually do it at a number of different levels. First of all, there is planning back up at the portfolio level to determine which projects we're going to do. And then once we get the project, very similar to a program, we create a roadmap, which will show us where we're going to go. And I'll show you one in a few minutes. And then within that roadmap, we identify releases, times when we're going to actually deliver something to the customer or the receiving organization. And we'll determine what's going to be in there. And then when we finally start to work on things, we will do another planning to just determine what actually is going to go into each one of those iterations. Next slide. We have this thing called backlog. Now, it actually shows up in the PMBOK guide already, and it's actually part of the current exam content outline as well as the new one. But we have a product backlog, which is everything. And how you determine what can be put on a product backlog, like I said, I equate it to my Amazon wish list. Anything can go on there at any time. Doesn't mean I'm going to do anything with it, or maybe it's going to be later on. My release backlog, I pull off of that product backlog those things that are going to be in this particular release. So whatever we're trying to do in this first delivery, we pull those back items off and put them into a release backlog. And then we're going to take those release backlog items and we will prioritize them so that we make sure that we develop and deliver the most important things first. Next slide. We use this thing called a user story. Now, to me, I don't see very often the third line of this, but I do see who and what do they want to do. So what they want to do is a requirement. It's the same exact thing. It's just that we've written it a little differently. And I think part of it, what it allows us to do is kind of look at these aspects from different points of view. Next slide. We use this idea of a persona. So that first line that said, I as a whomever want to do the following, will show us that we probably have maybe 3 or 4 different ways. So take an example of you want to register for this webinar. If you're a member of the chapter, that's one thing. If you're not a member of the chapter, if it's somebody from a different area, those are those different personas, which are going to tell us that we probably have 3, 4, maybe 5 different ways of doing the same requirement. So from my standpoint, regardless whether I really write it specifically as a user story, using this persona idea has really gotten me into more of a specific of what we're doing. Now, as a business analyst, those personas tend to be something that would go on a data model. So I would look at the different types of personas that I have, their relationships to different things. So that's business analysis and beyond what we're talking about today. Next slide. So here's my roadmap. And all my roadmap is doing is chunking the time and saying what features and functions would we be delivering at different points in time. Very high level. Everything under that then would say, I'm going to collect all the stories that I need to be able to work with to be able to get that member portal up. Maybe I look at the payroll capabilities now, and maybe I don't. This is a case where, once again, rolling wave and progressive elaboration are just completely involved in this process. Next page, next slide. So once again, I look at this and turn this upside down. I think this is probably the most important of anything when we look at how we do an Agile project. We don't look at what do we need to do and how long is it going to take and how much it's going to cost, but rather take that time frame on that roadmap and say, these are all the things we could do, but what must we do? What could we do as we go forward? Next slide. We have this idea of minimal viable product. So this goes back to, once again, more that incremental. What has to be there the very first time? What is the basic stuff that has to be there so that we make sure we get something out to the consumer fast? Maybe it's just a beta, maybe it's a test, maybe it's a research and development thing. But rather than trying to do everything, we just go with the minimum. I always use the idea of what does a cell phone really have to do? Just a cell phone, not a smartphone, but a cell phone. Take a call, make a call, maybe text messaging. Does a cell phone really need a camera on it? Or do we have something else that we could use? First release out. And there's a lot of people who just want that flip phone or whatever that just makes and takes phone calls. So minimal viable product. Next slide. So time boxing is the word we use to be able to figure out how we're going to, in my word, chunk this into different time periods so we decide what we have to do. So how much can you get done in that time box? This is where in Scrum, we usually talk 2 to 3 weeks that we're going to deliver something. Sometimes we find that we have to move to Kanban where it's a little bit longer time frame because we can't deliver anything of value in that short period of time. But what we're doing is making sure during that time we know what we're working on, we focus on it, and we get it done. Next slide. So what we do in that time box, we refer to as a minimal marketable feature, or MMF. So these are the small pieces. So for instance, go back to my phone. MMF would be to be able to make a phone call. Another MMF would be able to take a phone call. Those are the pieces that don't stand by themselves. They all have to be put together for that release. But it is something, it's a small piece of functionality that you decide has to be done, prioritized, and you put it out there. That's considered an MMF, or minimal marketable feature. Next slide. So we go through and have to determine what is the most important. What's the sequence? The sequence here, in most cases, is the priority to the value that is delivered to the business. And that prioritization most often comes from the business person. Now, we have a lot of different schemes we can use. Moscow is the one that we talk about the most because that's being able to make sure we know what we must have, what we should have, then what we could. And actually, it says would like. I usually say it won't because we won't have time. That's putting that into that upside down triangle because those would likes are not going to have, we're not going to have any room left by the time we get there. The Kano model is more of a marketing product type of model, which if you haven't ever seen that, go out to the internet and look at it. It's kind of an interesting way to look at prioritization also. Next slide. So this actually is a figure that comes out of the PMBOK guide on the way that the planning is done. So we have the roadmap with the releases. Each release then is broken down into smaller increments or iterations. And then for each iteration, we take those stories in that have been prioritized and we will break them down into tasks. Very, very similar to taking a work package on your WBS, moving it over into your schedule and identifying the activities that you need to do to complete that work package. Same concept, just different terminology. Next slide. So how do we come up with how much we can do? We use different types of estimating ways, but in most cases we talk about sizing, not estimating. We're not necessarily looking at how long something is going to take, but instead we're looking at how big it is or how much of it we can do. And sometimes we have to break it down so that we only do a portion of it because of the size. There's a lot of tools we can use here to be able to do the estimating. I personally like the story points rather than the hours because it has to do more with how big it is, how complex it is, rather than how many hours we think it's going to take us to complete it. We know what our time is that we have to get it done in. Slide. So go back a second to the team because we talked about the fact that the team size is small, full-time assignment, cross-functional. We talk about I-shaped people and T-shaped people. And I really like this concept because in some of the methods, especially Scrum, they talk about everybody has to be a generalist. They have to do everything. Well, especially I'm a database analyst. I don't want everybody designing a database. Now, updating it and adding to it, fine. But sometimes we need some people that have a little bit more specialty. But what this is saying is rather than having a whole bunch of people that just have one skill, we need to have a broader skill set, even though we don't go very deep on most of them. So think of the T being the different skill sets that an individual may have, very narrow or not very deep. And maybe in one area they go deep, as opposed to having everybody just be in that almost siloed type of a competency, which doesn't really work. Next slide. So co-location I mentioned before. Osmotic communication is the term we use for overhearing other conversations where we can learn from that. We also talk about the idea of caves in common. Many of our organizations now have gone to a very flat, very open environment to work in. Some people need quiet time to work. And so a lot of times that location we set up has areas that are very open and other areas that are quiet so that that work can be done. Next slide. Team ground rules. Now, this actually is in the PMBOK guide. It actually shows up twice, both as a team charter and ground rules. I think of it more as the ground rules because the ground rules are where the team itself decides how they're going to work together. But the key part here It is developed by the team members, and it is enforced by team members. So if they decide they need to identify that, hey, we need to have everybody on site by 10 o'clock in the morning, the team decides that, that's a working time. And if somebody doesn't actually meet that, we go back and look at, do we need to change it? But we need to, the team itself enforces it, not a project manager. Next slide. Some of the monitoring and tools and techniques. This is probably more communication than anything. Next slide. So we have this term called information radiator. Now, what that means is you openly display information for the team, for the stakeholder, for anybody to be able to see. It should be a lot of graphics, charts. They should each be self-explanatory, simple. Could be backlogs. It could be your task boards, which you'll see, could be the result of your testing. It's any type of information. So rather than keeping it inside of a computer and only certain people have visibility to it, the idea is that everybody should be able to see this. Next slide. The story task board, there's all sorts of different versions of this, but this is basically showing progress. I could actually say my Microsoft project schedule does the same thing. It's just that we just don't make it visible and we put too much information on it. Most often, your board itself has a minimum of 3 columns: to do, in progress, and done. So this is a case we're trying to figure out how fine do we want to look at this. The traceability matrix that is actually in the PMBOK guide is just a very complicated version of this. So we have a whole lot of different ways we can show, but this is to show progress. Everybody understands where we are. Next slide. Burn down chart. We see this once again in the PMBOK guide. This is a way to be able to show how much progress we've done within a period of time. So keeping track of how much has been completed. Now, the only thing on this is that we need to make sure we understand, when do we get credit for burning down the work that we've done? Is it that it's been completed? Is it that it's been accepted? Is it done? Those type of things. But it does graphically and quickly show how much we've accomplished and how much is remaining. Next slide. Just real quick, velocity is the term we use to understand how much we actually can do. So we look at how many of those story points we've been able to finish. It's not how much we've worked on, it's only counts if you finish it, meaning it gets accepted. We want to use that to be able to determine in the future how much we can say that we're going to do. Next slide. I don't want to go into this a whole lot, but the idea, one of the things that you'll see throughout the PMBOK guide is stakeholder involvement more and more. The more that you have the business people involved in the discussions and understanding, the more you're going to make sure that you're going to meet their expectations, be able to figure out when they start becoming resistant and how you move back from it. Next slide. We have a burn down chart that shows the progress we're making. PMI is very big on risk. They always have been. And so they actually have created this risk burn down chart in addition to being able to say, what are our top risks, and making sure that we watch those, and if we get past those, we bring those down also. A nice graphic to see. Next slide. So this definition of done is kind of an interesting thing from the standpoint that we always talk about done, but we have to define what done means. It's not 95% complete, or it's I finished the coding, but we still have to test, or I've done this, but I don't have the sign off yet, or QA, or whatever. The definition of done has to be determined by the team as to what it means. And then once again, on your burn down chart, determining when you get credit to burn that down. Next slide. Okay, when we talk about continuous improvement in Agile, we talk about continuous improvement of three things: the product, process, and the team members themselves. Next slide. So the process, we do retrospectives, we look at how we're doing, we tailor the process. The product, obviously, we're continually making changes to it, and we're looking at pieces of it being accepted. The team is being able to make sure that we are continuing to grow that whole develop team process that we have in the PMBOK guide. Very similar here. Next slide. A couple of things we specifically talk about, and I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going really quick, but you'll have these slides. You can look back at them a little bit more. But the idea of backlog grooming. We put stuff on the backlog, but the product owner and a lot of times the team member have to continually look at that to say, is that even valuable anymore? Reprioritizing it, maybe getting a little bit more information about it. And we call that backlog grooming or prune the product tree, things like that. Next slide. Daily stand-up. This is something that most organizations say, we're doing Agile because we do a daily stand-up. The key on the daily stand-up, it is not a daily status meeting. What it is a communication among the team members of what they're working on, what kind of challenges they have, so that they can help each other. That is the whole purpose. Construction does this all the time. First thing in the morning, everybody on the site gets together and talks to each other. What am I going to be working on? What did I have problems with? And that's exactly what this whole daily stand-up is. Critical. But it needs to be people face to face, not sitting in a cubicle doing your multitasking until it's your turn to speak. 15 minutes, that's all it is. We should be able to give that up to be able to work with the team as a whole. Next slide. The other thing is at the end of each iteration or whatever, we demonstrate what we've done because we have to get acceptance for it. Now, if you don't get acceptance, then you have to determine how close was I? Do I just bring it back into the next iteration and make those few modifications? Or maybe I'm so far apart between what it was expected, I need to leave it out and do some additional analysis before I try to do it again. Next slide. Retrospective. This is the big thing. Like I said, this actually got into the PMBOK guide as that new managed project knowledge process. But regularly, and when that is, depends on the team, we sit down and say, what did we do that we always want to do again, that really worked? Where are things we might improve? And we immediately put those in. We try to fix that now. We don't wait till the end of the project and say, oh, we should have done the following. No, we do it as we go through. We try it. And then at the end of the next iteration or whatever, we look and say, did it work? Or do I need to tweak it a little bit more? So it's very similar to lessons learned, but it's a matter that we want to do something with it. We don't want to just collect these things. Next slide. So I may put this in here just kind of as a fun thing because a lot of people don't look at this correctly. And regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everybody did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. This is where we have to really look at what happened and be truthful and be open to how we might be able to improve what we're doing. Next slide. So the other thing that happens is that we have to look at the process we use. Sometimes we do things we don't need to do. Sometimes we need to put things in to be able to do a little bit more because of the situation. They talk about taking an agile method and using it out of the box first. to take what's
Greta?
worked other places. Yeah.
All right, you are here back again. Okay, we lost you for a second.
Sorry about that. Okay, so next slide. I think I'm almost at the end, real quick. Next slide. So there's some agile myths here. It's not undisciplined, it's very disciplined. It doesn't control change. Yes, it does, but on a shorter time period. Creates fairly sufficient documentation. We like them to be full-time co-located. Generalists, more into the T-shaped people. It only works on small software projects? No, because we can break it up into small groups. And there's no need for a project manager. There is a need for a leader, as well as the fact that in most organizations, higher level reporting that needs to be done because a CFO is not going to walk into the room to see how things are going. So there's still some need, but we have to change from being a project manager to a project leader. Next slide. So some of the pros: frequent delivery, able to adapt, but the con, it's an organizational change. It's a mindset change. That is one of the biggest problems. So most cases, what we suggest is we try it on like a pilot team and prove that it works, and then we can expand it. Next slide. Some of the challenges: we have to be flexible with our scope. We have to be able to figure out why we're not achieving what we are. And then if we have a team member, we have to be open and figure out what we're going to do. There's nothing different here from a traditional project. Next slide. Run out of time, miss the schedule. Maybe we need to look at how much we actually have committed to. That's the velocity we need to know. Making sure that we're always producing something of value, making sure we understand why we didn't, has to happen. My point down here, if my scope, date, and budget are all truly fixed, are we really agile? Next slide. A few minutes over, apologize with the technical difficulty on the front end. So I don't know whether we can still open it up to questions or whether we have to go.
Yes, definitely. Okay, just a second. Let me check the. I'm stop sharing now my screen, guys, and let me open the floor for any questions you might have. So first of all, I would like you guys please use the chat window, and I'm going to ask Greta to check the chat window, or if you can't see the chat window, then I'm going to read the questions for you. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start with the first question. So Zoltan is asking the following question: could you recommend resources for agile tools, techniques for estimating? Example, planning poker, and for how to facilitate enjoyable and varied Scrum ceremonies. For example, various retrospective techniques. So the question is, could you recommend resources for agile tools and techniques, please?
Well, there's actually like 13 books that have different aspects of it. So I would start though with the practice guide. Seriously, I would look at it first, and then I would, from PMI, and then I would go back. There's a lot of references that are in there as far as how to do that. Your estimating techniques. The other thing is just go out to the internet. You know, planning poker is pretty well described a number of different ways out there. That's one we use a lot for estimating. But I would look at the references in the Agile Practice Guide, and then I would also go out just in the internet and do a search on certain things.
And the next question comes from Zoltan, and he is asking the following question: what may be the best resource for disciplined Agile?
That is one because it's new. It is mentioned in here. I am not sure. That's one of the things that I know is going to be discussed at the upcoming PMI conference next month in Philadelphia. So I am definitely on the lookout for all of it. So what I will do is probably after I get more information on that, and especially how PMI is looking at it, I will probably do a blog on that, and I can make that available.
Very much. Okay, so next question comes from Akush, and he's asking the following question. Agile only for mature, motivated, and self-organizing teams people? How about rookie team?
I didn't mention it in here, but one of the things I always talk about is theory X, theory Y. And the idea is that a theory Y person is the one that you want on an Agile team, not a theory X, because there really is nobody to tell exactly what needs to be done. So I think a lot of it more comes to the point of the team members are important. And one of the problems I see with Scrum is that the master doesn't have the ability to encourage somebody to leave the team who's not really suited for it. We put people on a team, they have to be self-starting, they have to be self-motivating, they pretty much have to be a theory Y. And I think that's one of the problems, that we don't necessarily look at not just the skill of the person, but also their attitude and the way they work with other people.
Next question comes from Peter. Peter is asking the following. Where can I learn more about the risk burn down chart?
Once again, in the Agile Practice Guide, they do a pretty good job on it. Not as much. I think the key is that the concept is that you do risk management the same as you always do. You look at the top 10, they call it a risk census as opposed to a risk register, but you look at the top 10 risks that are going to be possibly occurring during that particular time frame, and those are the ones that you put on the chart. And it's just like on a risk register, when you get a risk that, oh, it didn't happen, I'm past that time, you cross it off. Here you just burn it down.
Thank you very much. So let me ask you guys, if you have any further questions or comments or anything what you would like to share with Greta or myself, this is the right time for that. So please use the chat window and ask any questions you might have. If there are no further questions, it means this is the end of the webinar. Greta, I would like to say thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I really appreciate that you woke up so early in the morning, and I really appreciate that this is really a very, very exciting topic, and this is very, very close to my heart, and I would like to say thank you very much. And last but not least, guys, I would like to share with you a couple of things. Tomorrow is the PM Pub. As you know, this is an English-speaking event. More than 75 people signed up for the PM Pub. This time we are going to meet in the Magnet House, and this is on the Andrassy Street. So if you would like to join us, please go to the www.pmi.hu, go to the events, and still you can sign up for this event. That's one thing. The second thing, the Art of Projects is coming on the 7th of November 2019. We're going to rock the house, full house, 300 people are going to join us. Jim Steiner, the founder of PMI, will be with us, and so many other folks from the UK and Germany and United States. The other thing what I wanted to share with you, that 7th of November is not only the Art of Projects, but this is going to be the International Project Management Day. And this is the reason why we are going to announce the PMBOK version 6 Hungarian edition on this day. So actually, this is going to be available during the Art of Projects the first time. As Greta mentioned, if you would like to learn more about Agile practices, my recommendation to you, the Agile Practice Guide. You can buy this book in Hungarian version, or if you need it in English, please drop me an email. Either drop an email to info@pmi.hu, or you can use my private email, kremer.laszlo@pmi.hu, and I'm more than happy to help you. With that said, I really appreciate all your time, Greta, again. Thanks very much for joining us. This was a great pleasure welcoming you on board this morning. And guys, thank you very much for joining us. I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.